In this video, we're going to do a quick discussion about how to enter data into Excel and how to plot that data using Excel's functions. It's a quick rundown of the learning objectives we're going to be doing. First, we're going to start by talking about the advantages of the software Excel itself. We have a lot of different software available to us for graphing data. Excel has there's a lot of good reasons why we choose Excel as opposed to others. Getting into the actual details then, we'll talk about how to enter data into Excel, how to format those data tables properly so that you can insert them into a lab report or other document, how to then plot that data, and then how to format those plots properly, again, so you can insert them into an actual lab report itself. Over to the right, we have a graph similar to what you guys will be creating. This is an XY scatter graph showing a comparison between GDP, which is gross domestic product, basically how much money people make, versus their environmental or the ecological footprint. And as you can see here, based on the relationship, it seems like the more money a country makes per person, the more impact they have on the environment around them. These are the types of relationships we're going to try and draw from the graphs that we're creating. Now let's start with a discussion as to why you should be using Excel versus other types of software for graphing data. First of all, Excel is a very powerful software. At its surface, you put data in and make graphs, but underneath that surface there are layers and layers and layers and layers of different functions. Getting experience with the basics of Excel now is going to open the door for those deeper layers of functions later on. Generally speaking, if you're only using the basic stuff, it is a very easy software to use. Once you get past that easy stuff, however, it can get very complicated. But again, learning Excel now sets a base work or like a baseline for getting more accustomed to those better software levels. A lot of times we do our writing in Word, which is also a Microsoft product, and Excel obviously works very well with it. You can cut and paste tables and graphs right out of Excel and put them right into your Word document when writing a lab report. Lastly, and probably most important, Excel is what we describe as an industry standard. And when I say industry, I don't mean any particular industry, I mean all industries. Everyone uses Excel for spreadsheets and graphing data, and getting associated or comfortable with it now is going to make your life easier down the road. This is true in college. You'll be expected to do a lot of graphing there, almost regardless of what major you're choosing, and definitely in work. I find in my work experiences being good at Excel, or not being good at Excel, hasn't necessarily been bad for people, but people who are good with it come across as being very, very impressive. Let's start our Excel process by actually entering data into an Excel spreadsheet itself. In this situation, we're going to be plotting data that associates with spectrophotometry. We're going to be plotting the absorbance of certain solutions based on their concentration. To start your graphing process, I always recommend starting with headings. We're going to put concentration in the first column, and notice I'm going to label it with the appropriate unit. In this case, it is parts per million. And I'm going to put absorbance in the second column, and that is unitless, so we'll leave it blank. We can take these columns, notice my concentration column here gets cut off by the next column. We can grab the edge of any column and stretch it so that it makes the appropriate width so we can fit our data in here. Once you have the headings put in, we can then start adding in the actual data values. Our concentrations were 180 parts per million, 90, 45, 18.9, 4.5, and 0 parts per million, and those are the concentrations of our solutions. During our experiment, we ran these guys through the spectrophotometer and we collected the following data. So as you can tell from what I've been doing, entering data is simply a matter of clicking on the appropriate cell, typing in the information you're looking for, and then hitting the Enter key afterwards to move on to the next cell. You can always jump back and forth between cells simply by clicking on the cell that you're interested in. While this data does not require it, one other thing we could use in this process would be calculating actual results from this data. If you want to do calculations using Excel, there is a formula option. If you click on a cell and hit the equals button, all of a sudden Excel is looking for you to do some math as opposed to entering in a number. And you can click over here and notice that there are a lot of functions that we can do and a whole list of more of them that we can pull up as necessary. For example, I can take these guys here and I can say take the data value in this cell and add it to the data value in this cell, and we can hit enter and get a numerical answer for that. In this situation, that numerical answer isn't too valuable for us, but I'm just trying to demonstrate the process of what can be done. Likewise, we can take that calculation and we can repeat it by grabbing on this tiny box in the corner and dragging this down, and it will repeat that calculation for every single row of data. And notice I get new answers for every single time. This is a very quick and easy way to do lots of mathematical calculations without having to sit down with a calculator yourself. Excel does this stuff for us. If you have more questions about how to use these formulas, please come and see me, and I'll be glad to give you some more details. All right, we've taken some time and entered in some data using Excel. Let's go over a quick rundown of the things we've seen. First of all, you want to make a separate data table for each group of XY data points that you want to plot. For every graph you want to make, you're going to have a separate table for it, and that's going to make it easier to select that data and make the actual graph. Generally speaking, data should be written in columns, not rows. You should put your X data in the first column. You should put your Y data in the second column. This is what Excel will assume when you make the graph. If you reverse these around, you'll have a lot of repair work to do later. Finally, when working with data in Excel, you can make your life a lot faster and a lot easier by becoming familiar with the formula function. When you hit equals in Excel and then type in a formula, Excel won't punch in a number, but instead do some math for you. When you have many repetitive calculations to do, formulas can do that for you in a matter of seconds as opposed to 10 or 15 minutes by hand. All right, now that we've got our data table put together and ready to go, we want to take a little time to format it very quickly, and there's a couple things we can do. We've already talked about the fact that we can adjust column width of a column to fit the words or the numbers we're dealing with. We can also adjust the row height, again, to fit the numbers we're dealing with. If you want to start changing things like font sizes, these adjustments might be necessary. Another important thing to worry about when you're dealing with tables is putting in grid lines, and pretty much all tables should have grid lines. The way you can do that is a couple different ways. Select the data you want to add grid lines to. One way to do it would be to right-click on your data set and click this Format Cells options. There are tons of things you can change in here, but the one we're going to focus on here is borders. And once you have this selected, we can add in borders. Generally speaking, the thin line is enough. And we can add in borders to the outside and add in borders to the inside. And this will grid in all of our data. We can likewise select and unselect specific borders as necessary. When we hit OK, we can see that those grid lines are put in. Likewise, there's an option right up here in the ribbon on top for putting in grid lines, and there's a lot of different preset things that we can do here. For example, we added in all borders. I like a lot of times to add a thick border around the outside of my graphs or my tables. We can click on that and it'll change those outside borders to thick ones. These are just a couple quick things we can do to format these. Feel free to play around with that Format Cells option. When we hit Apple 1, feel free to explore in here, and there's a lot of different things we can change in order to make our graphs and tables look as fancy as possible. All right, we've had a chance to look at some of the options for formatting data tables. Again, let's summarize what we've seen. Data tables should always have headings for each column and each row, and those headings should come with units when appropriate. All data tables should have grid lines. Remember, there are multiple ways to add those grid lines in, either by right-clicking or choosing the grid line button up from the ribbon on top of the Excel spreadsheet. You should highlight important data, bold, different colors, etc., etc. If it's data that's relevant to your conclusions, that should be highlighted and separated from the data that you've already seen. And finally, we can adjust column width or row height simply by grabbing on the edges of our column and moving it left or right. If your text is too long or too small to fit in a particular cell, don't hesitate to adjust those cells so that they fit your text appropriately. Now that we have our data entered and properly formatted, the next order of business will be to make a graph from it. This process has been made very quick and easy by the newer versions of Excel. To make your graph, you simply need to select the data you want to actually graph, and I would have both columns there. And then we're going to go up here to the top on our ribbon, and there's an option here that says Charts. When we click on that Charts, the biggest thing for us is to choose the type of chart we're going to deal with. Almost always in this class, you're going to be dealing with XY scatters. When you click here, it gives you a bunch of options. The two options you really want to focus on is whether I want to do a marked scatter, which means it just shows the points, or I want to have connectors between those points. And that's going to depend entirely on the type of graph you're trying to make. In this scenario, I'm going to choose marked scatter because I'm going to add in my own line later as a trend line. When I click on Mark Scatter, I get a graph that looks like this, and this is everything we're looking for. A couple things you can focus on with this. First of all, Some quick formatting. There are chart layouts up here. We can click on this one to add in axes titles to make sure we have everything we're looking for. The second biggest recommendation I can have for this is to right-click on the graph and choose the option Move Chart. When you choose the option to Move Chart, it's going to move it from the sheet it's currently embedded in, and you typically want to move your chart to its own new sheet. It's going to get a tab down here on the bottom of the page, and we'll be able to print that graph much more easily. My warning before you do this sometimes causes Excel to crash. I recommend saving your data first before you lose all the work that you've done. When you're ready, click OK for the move and you'll get your graph on its own separate page. You can now spend some time formatting this graph by changing titles, labels, and deciding whether or not you need a key. We've had a chance to see our data turned into a plot. Let's go over some of the main ideas. First of all, when you want to make that data or that plot, you should select your group of data only. Use the click, drag over your data, and select that. Don't let other data fall into your select, or else you're going to end up having graphs that don't make sense. When you want to actually make the graph itself, there's a chart tab on top of the page, and you'll be asked to choose a chart type. 90% of the time in this class you'll be using XY scatter graphs. Your only real choice in most cases is to decide whether to use just markers, which are just the data points, or to have a graph with the connectors in between. If you're trying to just show a relationship, the connectors make sense. If you're going to make a trend line later, using just markers makes more sense. Once you've created your graph, you'll need to add in titles and axes, labels, and keys. There are general chart formats up on top. Choose one that makes most sense for what you're working with. Generally speaking, the first is your best choice. Finally, always move your chart to a new sheet. If you're going to print that chart later, having it on a new sheet is going to make that printing work. If you don't move it to a new sheet, the end result will be that you get half of your graph printed on one page and half of your graph printed on the other. One word of warning, as we already said, when you go to move, for some reason this version of Excel tends to crash sometimes when you move your graphs. I very strongly recommend saving. Our last phase of the process here when we're going to format our graph is putting in appropriate titles and axes labels. For example, just the word absorbance I don't think really describes what this table actually is. Table or graph tables can get very, very complicated depending on what it is you're trying to talk about. In this sense, this graph is the absorbance of copper solutions at 620 nanometer wavelength. So again, this title is much more descriptive of what we had here. On the y-axis, we have our absorbance. This is unitless, so we'll leave it as unitless. On our x-axis, we have concentration. And its units, as we said before, were parts per million. So we can type in the word concentration there to label these axes. All these axes labels come from what our original data was. Since we've only plotted one set of data points, one line here, this absorbance legend here is not very useful for us. We can select it and press the delete button, and it makes our graph a little bigger. If we were plotting multiple lines, we would definitely want to keep that legend there. We've now formatted our graph with appropriate titles and labels. The last thing you want to focus on is sometimes we want to use a trend line. They're very easy to add in. If you right-click on a data point, there are many options here, one of which is to add a trend line. Our data appears to be very linear, so we'll stick with that option there. Always go over here and click on this Options tab. There are a lot of things you can do in here. Typically speaking, the one we're most interested in is to display an equation and display an r-squared value for our line. We can hit OK. Notice our equation and r-squared values show up here. Feel free to move this to an appropriate location on your graph so that it is easier to see. All right, let's wrap this up. We've had a chance now to spend some time formatting our plots. Let's make sure we go over some of those key points there. As I said before, make sure your plots have appropriate titles and labels for your axes. That title should be very descriptive of everything that's showing up in your plot, and it can be long. Don't hesitate to fake the fact that you have a sentence-like title. Next question you should always be asking yourself is, do I need a key or do I not? If you only have one plotted set of data, grab that key and delete it. You don't need it. If you have multiple data sets plotted, the key is very, very important. When you're making your labels for your x and your y axis, not only should you describe what the axis is, but the axis should also have a unit associated with it, unless for some reason your data value is unitless. Finally, if adding in a trend line or regression, when you go to do that, you right-click on the data points, you choose Add Trend Line, and don't hesitate, and don't forget to go to the Options section and make sure you display the equation and display the r-squared value as well. Alright, so that's our basic rundown for how to enter data in and plot using Excel. At this stage in the game, you should be able to enter data into Excel for reports and plotting. You should be able to format those tables so that they look nice for your reports. You should be able to then take that data and plot it as an XY scatter plot, and then finally format those plots again so that they're properly formatted and set up for your lab report itself. This will be something we'll be using in class very regularly. Feel free to check back to this video as often as possible to remind yourself about the whole process